Dale Carnegie versus Chris Voss. Wanted to take some time to compare these two speakers, communicators, and influencers. Because obviously there's a bit of the contrast between the two, right? One has written a very popular book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. The other one is coming from a background of like FBI, hostage negotiation, and so very different backgrounds, right? Now, Dale Carnegie, when he was born into more of a life of poverty as a farm boy, I believe in Missouri, in the USA. And so in his early years, his family dealt a lot with poverty, and they struggled with, just like difficult circumstances in general. So they kind of wanted to escape from that life. And then I believe a bit later, like they moved into like more of the city, like New York and things like that. So eventually, like the mother of Dale recommended that he would become like a missionary or like do something with like speaking. And so Dale thought about his idea, but like initially he wanted to get more like into publishing books because that was more of like his passion. And so he tried to do that a lot, but he didn't really find success with that. Then eventually he started his career as like a teacher, and he tried to give like a lot of speeches to his classes, and he put a lot of like effort into that and a lot of other things in his life, but he didn't really find success. And so eventually Dale, with these classes, he was like, I gotta make something out of this. And then he got the idea that instead of him speaking to the class, he would actually work with people and get them in front of the class and like get them to speak instead. So I watched a documentary on Dale before I made this video. And so that was interesting because now people were more engaged with this class. And I think that also probably meshed well with Dale's natural style of caring for people, like wanting the best for people and like wanting people to evolve like in a spiritual way because of like his missionary, thing. And so people like really caught onto that workshop and started becoming more and more popular. And what they found, because Dale is coming from like the 1850s or like let's say maybe 1900s. So Dale is coming really from a time where people really weren't aware that this was something that they could work on. People, even nowadays, like still a lot of people aren't aware that they can actually improve their social lives and their skills. And so what he found in working with his class is that a lot of people didn't really want to necessarily, they didn't really necessarily want to improve in like business type of communication, but he found that people really wanted to improve like their personal life, just the way they communicated to their friends and people in general, that they could feel more confident and they felt like they could be more like themselves and connect better with people. That's what he found that people in his workshop really wanted. So that kind of set the agenda for his career, and that's how he found success in that. And then eventually he wrote a book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Now, Dale's main strategy for achieving confidence and for achieving like good speaking skills was like genuine connection and like one of like cooperation and like benevolence towards the other person, right? So that was like his intent, and that was his perspective on the way he worked. Now, I think that there are some limitations to this because he didn't really acknowledge like the shadow side of things, and I think, personally, I think that's why his first marriage was a disaster, and he didn't really adhere to his own principles. But he's coming from a time where a lot of people were more stuck in this mindset of, if you want to achieve something with people, you need to punish them for bad behavior. And so he really was able to shift the mindset of his generation and the people in his time, and a lot of business leaders and just people that wanted to connect better with more of like the benevolent approach. And it's actually both the similarity between Chris Voss and Dale Carnegie is that they both have a very benevolent approach. Because even Chris Voss, he's a bit tougher, right? But he's still coming from a place of integrity and a place of benevolence. Because the thing is, if you want to work together with someone, it's in the word, right? If you want to achieve results, especially in business or like as a friendship, obviously that can't work if there is no cooperation, right? So that's why a lot of these things like in sales and business focused on that, because that's really the point of it. If there's too much like manipulation or like unethical stuff or like too much conflict, then the partnership isn't really very productive. So it is a requirement, a necessity to come always from a place of good intentions and benevolence when you want to achieve a certain result. That doesn't mean that, again, it doesn't mean that the shadow side of life is not a reality. But usually that's more because it's not possible to make a cooperation. Because obviously when you want to achieve a result with a certain person or a certain group, obviously you need to come from a place of cooperation. So when we look at Chris Voss is coming from a place of, he really wanted to get into the FBI as like a hostage negotiator, right? So early in the book, his book, I think the title is Ever Split the Difference? And so he writes about how he's trying to get into the FBI as a hostage negotiator, but he didn't really succeed in that at his first try. So then they actually recommended him, someone that he knew recommended him that he started working in like a suicide hotline. So this was where people who had like thoughts that they, wanted to end themselves, Chris needed to give them, stop their thinking and like give them inspiration to go on. So a very, very tough situation, right? Very stressful, under a lot of pressure. Now, this is where he really developed these skills of like integrity and human influence. And these skills gave him the ability to then also work as a hostage negotiator for the FBI. And so in his book is like a phase where he talks about bringing those skills from FBI hostage negotiation world more into the sales and business world. So that is an interesting part, because that's usually a side that you don't really hear a lot, right? So that's interesting. I personally never have heard this perspective of like FBI negotiation applied to business. And so even though they both focus a lot on like benevolence and good intent, Chris Voss really takes more of in my opinion, integrated approach. I think it's important to have like be able to deal with tough situations. Like I think that's important. So Chris Voss is really someone who specializes with that. And so the techniques that he's bringing in the book, they're really coming from a place of cooperation, first of all, but then secondly, a place of like being able to handle pressure. But I think the most important message that he brings in the book is that you always want to come from a place of trying to understand the other person, even if the other person is a villain, a murderer, or holding like a lot of people hostage. Because what he says in the book himself is that this is the most effective way to get results with these people. And so if you look at it from one perspective, I do believe everyone sort of deserves like a basic human rights, right? Even those villains, maybe. But obviously there's also like the place where they did a lot of things wrong. And so in general, but especially as an FBI agent, you want to be able to withhold justice as well, right? So that's very, I think, difficult to be able to hold empathy for someone like that, while at the same time still wanting to ensure justice. And so the way he talks about it is it's tactical empathy, because it's tactical empathy because you need empathy in order to get a result with them so that they feel understood, even though it might not necessarily be what they deserve. It's just the best way to get results. That's how he explains it. So that doesn't like fully make sense 100% to me, to be honest. But I do think like there's a certain logic to it that does make sense. And it's an interesting thing for me to think about. It's an interesting perspective to think about. So I think it's weird when you take this idea and apply it to sales, because in sales, you usually want to have genuine empathy. Because you genuinely want the best for the other person, right? And perhaps that's even the case with Chris Voss, with his criminals and people like that. I don't know. But in sales, it's definitely the case that you want to come from a place of genuine empathy. So you don't really want to use empathy just because you want to get results in sales. That's usually not the way you want to go about it, is my opinion. But it's an interesting perspective to think about. And it's also interesting that all the techniques that he lists in his book, they're based a little bit on NLP, but most of them, it's really a lot on just trying to get understanding and the feeling of benevolence between both parties so you can get them to cooperate. And it's a lot of like tonality things as well, right? Because he talks a lot also about how tonality is important to get a certain reaction from the villain in his case. Because you want to get them to cooperate and to hand themselves in, right? That's what you're trying to do as a hostage negotiator. So obviously that's like a very, very stressful situation, and I wouldn't imagine myself doing that the way he does. So I wouldn't be able to do it. Like maybe if it took like 10 years to like train that, then maybe, but I think it's quite impressive. I think it's an interesting perspective to think about. And it's interesting to see also how like a lot of the communication skills are like quite similar as like, the foundations of it, right? You want to come from a place of like benevolent understanding, and a place of being able to move the other person to get a certain desired result. So it's a bit of a long video. Let me know if you think it was interesting. There's probably some things I could have made better, but I have some things I need to work on. But yeah, if you liked the video, if you have any ideas on how I can make it better next time, please let me know. Be sure to check out my next video if you like this one. And I will see you guys around. I hope you have a nice day. Cheers.